Hey Brandon, where do we start? Because I don't know. Is this a wild weekend, man? It's like Ole Miss, Alabama, Indiana. What do you want to do? Hey, dealer's choice, Brandon.
I would just say the SEC like falling flat on its face. You
Yeah.
got three ranked teams all hit the road and they lose, and it's opened the door, I think, for the ACC now to get two teams in instead of one, and it's knocked, I think, Alabama out of the playoff race, definitely Ole Miss out of the playoff race, but because of other moves being made around those top 12 or whatever you want to say, I still think there's a slight path for the SEC to get four teams in the playoff, but it's looking more and more like it's going to just be three, and the Big Ten is going to lead the way with four teams. So the SEC in their biggest moment, their biggest weekend to prove itself worthy of getting a lot of teams in the playoff, just fell with a big loud thud this week.
Then, in your mind, did the SEC's depth as a conference bite it in the butt, or is the SEC overrated?
I think the SEC is a little overrated this year. I do think it's the deepest conference among the Big Ten and the SEC, but the problem is that the Big Ten up top is much better than the SEC, and so that's why you're not seeing a lot of Big Ten teams in the top half losing on the road this year. Whereas with the SEC, they're not as good up top as the Big Ten, and so when they go on the road, they're losing. And you'll hear all week, I hate politics, but this week and next week, you're going to hear a lot of politicking from all the conferences, but especially the SEC in the media about why they're the best conference in America, why they're so deep, and why they deserve to have four teams in the playoff, even if the metrics and some of the numbers that the playoff committee utilizes will show differently. But you're going to hear that a lot. You're going to hear a lot from Greg Sankey, the commissioner, and the SEC media about, well, the SEC is real deep, and only two teams in the SEC have a winning record on the road this year within the conference, and that's because the conference is just so darn good. Yes, it's very, very good, but the top half of the SEC is just not as good as the top half of the Big Ten.
Let's sit in the SEC then for a minute before we go around. And so Georgia's going to make it. Texas is going to make it. Looks like Tennessee should make it because they're not going to have to play in the SEC championship game. So there's three. Texas A&M still could make it if they beat Texas and they win the SEC championship against Georgia. So there's possibly a fourth. Is that the possible fourth to you, or is Bama, or is there any chance in the world South Carolina somehow backs into this thing?
I think that's very possible. We don't know what the playoff committee rankings are yet this week, but I would say, based off of recent success and also the metrics, that South Carolina would edge out Alabama for a potential fourth spot if the SEC was in position to do so. But it also depends, of course, on what happens within the SEC and then elsewhere. The best thing that could happen from South Carolina is for Texas to win this week against A&M and then to win the SEC championship game, which would help them potentially. But South Carolina, when you look at their recent resume, they've won. If they win this week against Clemson on the road, they will have won four straight games against top 25 opponents. And they've got close losses on the road at Alabama and, of course, at home much earlier in the season against LSU. And I know head-to-head is a big thing, but Alabama and South Carolina are not the same teams they were when they met in mid-October. South Carolina has completely turned a corner and has gotten better since then. Alabama has gotten worse since then, as evidenced by them losing 24-3 this week on the road at Oklahoma. So I would say if there's a fourth team, and if we're talking about Alabama or South Carolina, you've got to give the edge to South Carolina, in my opinion.
Do you think the committee factors in, though, that the team is not the same team as it was when it is a head-to-head, even though it was earlier in the year?
They say they do, and they say they will. We'll see. And listen, based off of even last year, they do, because that's the reason why they left Florida State out of the playoff last year. They said Florida State was not the same team because they didn't have quarterback Jordan Travis, who was injured in the last 2 weeks of the season. So South Carolina, which have been struggling with some injuries themselves, especially at quarterback with Lenore Sellers, is healthier now, and they're playing much better now, and they're on a roll. So judged off that, they should. And you got to weigh more heavily the recent success of a team compared to what they were doing in the first few weeks of the season. That just makes sense. For example, look at the men's basketball tournament. The committee weighs big time what you do in the last 10 to 12 games of a season more so than they do in the first half of the schedule. And with college football, I think you definitely have to take that into consideration. Plus, in addition to that, the injuries that South Carolina were dealing with earlier in the year.
So let's say Texas, we'll hypothetical this thing because, again, I just want to use semi-precedent, because, again, we weren't a 12 team until this year, but semi-precedent here. Let's say Quinn Ewers, who has to get an MRI, which I saw yesterday, he may not play. Let's say they lose to Texas A&M. Texas A&M goes to championship game. Therefore, Texas has a couple losses. They're down their starting quarterback. Jordan Travis, we saw last year at Florida State. However, I think the big difference would be Texas has played their backup quarterback and had success. So do you think the committee would penalize them for losing their starting quarterback if Ewers can't play, even though their backup quarterback has played a significant amount of time and his last name is Manning?
I think the penalty for them would be more so just losing to A&M no matter who the quarterback is, and also because their resume right now doesn't include a big win. It doesn't include a top 25 win on that schedule. You know, their biggest win so far really has been at Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt's not ranked right now, and they just lost again to LSU on the road. Texas doesn't have a great quality win. What's helped them is, one, their brand, and number two, when they've won games, they've mostly won so going away. Heading into this past week, they were tied with Oregon for number one among teams that have won games by 19 points or more this season. They've kind of been like a boring team. They just kind of bludgeon everybody. But then in the big moments when they have an opportunity to get that big resume win, for example, when Georgia came to town, they got their brains beat in. They were beaten by double digits in a game that wasn't even really that close by 30 to 15 margin. And they don't have that big win. This is their opportunity this week to get that big win. And if they were to win this week, maybe that obviously keeps them in the playoff. And they would be in the playoff because they would go to the SEC championship game. Even if they lost, they would still get in. But I would argue that you lose at Texas A&M, you should be out because of your resume.
And I'm going to use that to pivot over to the Big Ten because there are a lot of similarities. The parallels between Texas and Indiana, wild. Like the one game they played where they had to play somebody, which Texas was Georgia, Indiana was Ohio State. They got whooped pretty bad. And let's go over to the Big Ten and let's talk about that first drive. I was like, oh, Indiana came to play. Like, game on. I called a buddy. I was like, let's go. Signet. And then special teams ended up being kind of the first thread that was pulled. And then it was just a talent difference. Your thoughts after watching Indiana, Ohio State, and what should happen with Indiana?
Yeah, I've still got Indiana safely in the playoff. As long as they beat Purdue this week, they should get in. Just because of the other chaos that happened with those three other SEC teams that were in contention losing this week. It hurt them because they gifted 14 points to Ohio State through special teams. Punt return for a touchdown, and of course that bad snap that was muffed by the punter that Ohio State was able to recover and then score on a short field. Gifting Ohio State 14 points is terrible. Doing so when you're on the road at Ohio State, it's next to impossible to come back from that. I think the big thing to take away from this game, though, is that Indiana couldn't do anything offensively after that first drive. The first drive was a 70-yard drive for a touchdown. They go up 7-0. And then the next 10 drives, the rest of the game, they only have 81 yards on 10 drives, 10 possessions. Very, very bad. Ohio State's got one of the best defenses in the country. I would argue maybe top two, maybe it is the best one in the country. But Indiana's offense is no slouch. They've been in the top five for most of the season. They've done stellar job there. Curtis Rourke at quarterback, Elijah Surratt, who's been incredible at receiver, and they completely shut them down. It just hurts because you gift them 14 points, and then Ohio State, instead of kneeling the ball there late in the game, they score another touchdown to make it a 23-point win. So you're talking, I know we're playing hypotheticals and subtracting math and all this, but you're talking about maybe a one-possession loss for Indiana on any other day, despite your offense struggling and only putting up 151 yards in that game. And the reason for that is because Indiana's defense actually did a pretty good job in that game. They held Ohio State for under 300 yards all the way up until that final drive. They did enough to win that game defensively, also forced 2 turnovers, a pick, and then also a turnover on downs there in the first half. It's just that the offense was their undoing.
Yes, just a little bit of carnage, and maybe none in the Big Ten, especially if Indiana makes it. We almost saw Penn State lose, but we did not see Penn State lose. That game was probably a little closer than anyone expected, but they won't be penalized for losing that game at all, right? Like, they're in.
Penn State's absolutely in. And Penn State, I think, has done very well on the road this year. You know, you're talking about the SEC team struggling on the road. Penn State's done very well. They've got really 3 impressive road victories to me: USC, Wisconsin, and then this past week against Minnesota. You know, against Minnesota, it was a 26-25 game. It ended up being the final. But Penn State faced a 4th and 1, I think, on their own side of the field in Minnesota territory in the final minutes, and they faked a punt, and they got it, a big gain. And then on that same drive, they had to pick up another 4th and 1, and they did so through the air to keep the drive alive, and then they were able to kneel the ball. So they were able to convert 2 big 4th downs on the road at Minnesota in a 1-point game to seal the win. It was a very good job, I think, by James Franklin and co. to get that done, because James Franklin, as we all know, is a very conservative coach when it comes to just calling plays and making decisions, wants to punt to win. But he went for it there at Minnesota, and it proved huge because they were able to kneel out the clock. If they gave the ball back to Minnesota, they may very well have lost that game and been out of the playoff hunt.
We'll go to Big 12. I thought my brain was going to explode because I just watched the second half, and just in general, like, that was just a wild day for that conference, even more so than the SEC, I think. But I was watching the Arizona State BYU game. That last series, the last 2 series, like, I was like, what is, until the Cowboys the next day, I didn't have a final 2 minutes where my mind was like, holy crap, because you saw the strategy of, with Arizona State basically trying to run the clock out, them running backward, right? 20-yard loss, 20-yard loss. Then we're just going to chunk it as high and as far as we can and let the time expire, except there's 1 second. And then the fans storm the field. That has got to be so difficult to get all those fans off the field. And we've seen that like 3 times this year where fans storm the field a bit early. Then BYU catches the Hail Mary, but on the 2-yard line. It was the craziest game that ended up being exactly what we thought it was going to be. Just it took like 6 extra minutes for it to get wild and crazy. Now, for me, to ask you, because that's just how my mind was running during it, the actual macro version of this is BYU lost again. Arizona State won again. I believe Arizona State, if all goes well, will play. If they beat Arizona, we'll play in the Big 12 championship. Is Arizona State good?
Oh, yeah, very much so. I've had them like just behind Colorado as the top team in the Big 12. And then Colorado obviously lost on the road against Kansas this week. So Arizona State to me is the best team in the Big 12 right now. And there are, talk about confusing, there are 256 scenarios for who is going to meet in the Big 12 championship game. And we've got 1 week remaining, and that's it. 256 scenarios, 9 teams still alive, somehow mathematically, to get into the Big 12 championship game. But the 2 teams that have the best opportunities and the best pathway through all those scenarios is Arizona State and Iowa State. Arizona State's playing better than anybody else in the Big 12 right now. They're knocking off the big dogs right now as well. And despite all that craziness at the end, Arizona State really kind of dominated that game. They got up 21-0 in the first half. Cam Scatabo, their incredible running back, scored 3 touchdowns during that time. Autographed the ball in the end zone and got flagged for it, which was funny after a touchdown. But Arizona State's legit. Kenny Dillingham has done a hell of a job there. This is only his 2nd year. And going into this past week, I thought it was really between him and Deion Sanders, really for maybe National Coach of the Year or at least Big 12 Coach of the Year. And I think Dillingham just eked out Deion this past week. But again, that could change here in the last game of the regular season because Colorado's still alive in the Big 12 title hunt, as well as Arizona State. A wild weekend coming up in the Big 12. Again, 256 scenarios. It's incredible. They need to figure this all out, by the way, Bobby. We got rid of divisions in a lot of these conferences, and it's just made things so much more complex in these tiebreaker scenarios. It's ridiculous. I mean, just last week, Oregon, after winning their game on a Saturday, had clinched a Big Ten championship spot But the Big Ten said, wait a second, no, they haven't. It took them 72 hours until that next Tuesday to figure out, oh, yeah, because of tiebreaker scenarios we have, Oregon did actually clinch a spot after we said maybe they hadn't. And they announced it on a Tuesday afternoon. We've never seen that before. They need to figure something out here because we can't do this every single year. I know it prompts interest, which draws eyes, draws viewers, and draws readers and everything and all the mediums, but it's way too confusing. Why does college football, why does college sports for that matter, always have to take the most difficult path to figure out a way to crown a champion?
Yeah, it's like the super conferences are cool, but then when there are so many teams in them and they can't all play each other, which you just can't mathematically all play each other, some suffer because Indiana could have played a couple better teams if they just happened to have been scheduled, right? Them playing like the worst 7 or 7 of the 8 worst teams in the Big Ten, that is not their fault. They beat everybody they were scheduled. And again, what gets used against them is something that they had no control of. Now, they did lose to Ohio State. But yeah, you're right. The super conferences are cool, but unless more of these teams can play more of the teams in, we're going to have this every single year. It's why I like the SEC having a 9th game. Yes, will it be harder on them? But there's still another option to play more of the teams.
I will say this, but the Big Ten has 9 conference games themselves, and we're still having a scenario there, like I mentioned with Oregon. This is what we need to do, in my opinion, and I'm trying to look out for the best interests of both sides. Okay, all these conferences want to make more money. They want to draw eyes, draw interest. So do this: if you have 16 teams or more in your conference, do a pod system of 4 teams in each pod or whatever you got to do, and take the champions from those pods, your divisions, and have them play a mini playoff of your own to crown a conference champion. So in the SEC, take your top 4 teams in those pods and play 2 games. Play semifinals and then an SEC championship game. That gives you an extra 2 games to the season that you can sell to your ESPN conglomerate or whatever, make more money. And then it also, I think, crowns a clear and concise champion in the SEC, because at that point, if, like you said, not everybody can play everybody, but your best teams, without a doubt in your conference, would play each other at some point thanks to that 4-team, 2-game playoff system within your own conference to settle on a champion.
I think if we're changing rules, let's change another one too, the overtime rule. I do like that they both get a chance to have the ball, right? Which is better than what the NFL does it in the playoffs, but I think the NFL system, again, flawed. But I don't like, because it goes to the 2-point conversion, which we saw Texas A&M and Auburn. That's just like rolling dice. Like, that's one play. What I don't like initially about what they do is you literally could gain no yards and score points. Like, it's like, okay, let's go. Let's say run for 1 yard, run for 1 yard, run for 1 yard, kick a field goal, 3 points. You could win the game by actually doing nothing on offense. If I were changing the rules, I would scoot them back, and every time that we went to second overtime, move them up 5 yards. So start at the 50, then second overtime, 45. And we're still getting closer to making it a bit easier to score so we don't go forever. And I think you and I have both seen a couple 7 overtime games that went forever and are legendary in our minds. But when it goes to just a 2-point conversion, that just seems like it's not even declaring a real winner. It's just like, we're tired. Let's just do something to end the game.
Yeah, I agree with you. I like that idea. Start at the 50 and then bring it in 5 yards closer with each overtime going in. I love that idea.
You can't kick a field goal, right? At the 50, I mean, if you don't get a first down or maybe even 2, you can't kick a field goal. Therefore, you cannot score on offense. And again, they want to make sure these don't go forever. So move it in 5 yards every single time, and eventually 4 overtimes in, you can kick a field goal. But the Texas A&M guy dropped the ball. I felt terrible for him. But again, what a stupid scenario that we're at 2-point conversions. I don't like the 2-point conversions. Your thought on that?
I don't like it either. A couple years ago, there was a 9 overtime game between Illinois and Penn State, whatever it was, and it was just 2-point conversion after 2-point conversion, and it was dramatic, but it was also just like you said, it was like we're flipping a coin out there on every 2-point conversion, and also these teams only have so many 2-point conversion plays in their back pocket, and they're starting to call things that they wouldn't even normally call in those type of situations. But yeah, I'm with you. I don't like that. It's a very weird, broken system. I even prefer the previous iteration of it before all this, when it was just, you start off at 25 or 30 or whatever, and then after the second or third overtime, you have to go for 2 points instead of just a regular extra point kick or whatever. But I don't like them doing this 2-point conversion thing after the second overtime. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I have three final questions. I do want to talk about Kansas in that big game. And it's not a shock because Kansas has been playing really well the last few games. But as Kansas beats Colorado, and, I was watching Coach Prime say, hey, look, we were smelling ourselves. And I liked what he said after. I thought he was super mature. He was the grown up in the room even after that loss. But with Kansas, I think they started 2-6, 2-4.
Yeah.
And we've had the Kansas coach on, and we loved him. But going into the offseason for the Kansas program, even though I think they may end up at best be 500, do you feel like there's some momentum for that program just because of how all these top 25 teams they've beaten at the end of the year?
Yeah, I mean, they're the first team with a losing record in the FBS to beat 3 straight ranked teams. And they've been playing, they're the reason why the Big 12's in chaos right now, because they've beaten 3 of the top teams in the Big 12 standings going into this final week. But that also tells you, we're about to lose something here in college football. And from that standpoint is, the era of super seniors, like the 6-year seniors, some 7th-year receivers, because of the previous pandemic or whatever, you're able to keep an extra year of eligibility. So a lot of these guys for Kansas were able to stay there on the roster an extra year or two. And that's why they're playing so well. That's why Kansas was one of the favorites, one of the top 3 or 4 teams to contend for the Big 12 in the preseason, because they had so much experience returning. And it didn't pan out early. I think part of that was because they were dealing with a new offense, a new offensive coordinator, and it took them some time to get used to that. They also were dealing with some injuries, but now they've got it rolling, and you're seeing exactly what they could have been this entire season, which is going to be a Big 12 contender because they're so experienced. Devin Neal, goodness gracious, he put up 287 yards, more than 200 on the ground himself, a senior, a guy who's got a lot of experience, and they leaned on him against Colorado. They didn't punt a single time against Colorado, and they held the ball for more than 40 minutes of the 60-minute game. Just an absolute masterclass in keeping the ball out of that explosive offense of Colorado.
2 questions left. SMU, Miami, I think they're both in.
As of this moment, yes. I think the ACC was able to get 2 teams back on the map now because of the SEC's problems. If Miami wins this week at Syracuse and gets to the ACC championship game, yes. And SMU is going to have to beat Cal this week to keep that alive, that 2-team scenario. I think if it ends up being SMU and Clemson in the ACC championship game, it'll probably still be a 1-team in that playoff. But at this point, I think if SMU and Miami both make it, and they do so after wins this week, they both should be, in my opinion, in the playoff.
Final question, you mentioned Miami, Syracuse, and that's just, the rivalry week is usually just fun because it's rivals. But there are some pretty good games that are going to actually affect the college football playoff, which I think makes it even that much more fun. I think Arizona can beat Arizona State. Arizona has not played well this year, but I think they have the talent to actually scoop up a victory there. I think Syracuse, they're top 25 now, right? Did they hit this week?
I think they're just outside it, but they're a borderline top 25 team and have been most of the year.
And I think they can beat Miami. I think Georgia Tech, won't be the favorite to beat Georgia, but have shown glimpses of being a team that can actually play with a really solid Georgia. So there are so many of these games that probably would not matter except for the rivalry part of it that are of extreme value because it's the final week before the conference games. Which one do you see? Which of these rivalry games do you actually see there being an upset and it's shifting it again?
Great question. I think the opportunity is there for Texas A&M. I think everybody's low, obviously, on A&M after losing at Auburn, but they're different at home. They're much different against a rival at home. Texas and A&M haven't played in 13 years. A&M's been waiting for this forever, and Texas has to go on the road. And Texas does not own a big win, obviously, all season, and they have to go on the road to College Station. Very difficult spot, and A&M's got an opportunity to maybe play into the SEC championship game, though that doesn't look – I don't know. I have to look at the tiebreakers, but A&M's potential to play itself back into the playoff hunt, and Texas maybe to play itself out of it, despite being in the top 4 or 5 at this moment. So I think that one's prime for an upset. I think if Georgia had to go on the road to Georgia Tech, I'd be much hotter on Tech there because Tech obviously has already beaten Miami this year. but they go to Georgia and rightfully so are a double-digit underdog. So I don't see really there being an upset threat there to me. Another one to watch, though, is Tennessee at Vanderbilt. Tennessee looks like it's maybe in the playoff right now, potentially. And Vanderbilt, as we've seen, they've been giant killers all season. That's a very dangerous spot for the Volunteers.
Can I throw one more at you? Notre Dame USC at USC Super Bowl.
It is, but I don't trust USC's offense at this moment with the new quarterback out there. He's playing okay, but they just didn't quite get as explosive as I expected this past week against UCLA. And I think Notre Dame is playing about as good as anybody in the country. They're on a 9-game win streak. They've won those games by an average of 33 points. They look like, to me, one of the top 3 or 4 teams in the country. In fact, I rated them number 3 this week.
Brandon, good to talk to you. It's awesome. I love the college football playoff. It has made life so much more interesting, so many more things to talk about, so many more games to care about. And then I do like a beautiful mind, and then I drive myself crazy doing all the notes. Oh, God, what's going to happen? Thank you, dude. Good to talk to you, and we will talk to you again sometime soon. See you, buddy.
All right, see you, Bobby.